Hi, and welcome to episode 1 of The Thinking Shift. I am super excited to be here with you. My name is Patricia Stepler, and each week we are going to explore one idea that challenges conventional thinking and helps us to create meaningful, measurable results. Today's thinking shift is one that has shaped pretty much my entire life's work. And it's why training doesn't always create change. In fact, training alone rarely creates much change. So have you ever noticed you've attended an incredible conference or a workshop and you were excited, your notebook was full, you had all these ideas and you couldn't wait to put them into practice and get back to work and do what was being shown in that training? But what happens? It's probably not because the speaker wasn't good or that the information wasn't good. And it's probably not that the training wasn't practical or you probably wouldn't have gone in the beginning. So there's something much deeper taking place. Now, I know this from experience because for years I did training and I would go in and do a public or a corporate training, and I'd be there a day. And I try to get people, encourage them to maybe make some purchases of off-the-shelf type learnings that they could continue with. But inside, I knew that this was never going to be enough, because what happens to a lot of those off-the-shelf type trainings? Right, they remain on that shelf and never come off it. And so that's what you're up against. There's no reinforcement. And that's why I finally left that job, was because I was frustrated, because I know no matter how well I presented the material and how well I encouraged people to make change, I knew that that change was probably not going to be sustained. Oh yeah, it may be for a week or two if they were super excited and took it to heart and implemented. But I also know that our habits can get in our way. So let's think about that. We live in this information economy. There has never been a time when you couldn't find information. You know, you have a question, what do? You Google it, right? And you find that answer to whatever you're looking for. And you don't always know it's the correct answer, perhaps, but a lot of times it's pretty darn close. But we have access to podcasts where we can listen and gain information and maybe develop a relationship with that podcaster, like I'm hoping you'll develop with me in these thinking series. And you expand on that whole idea. But even at that point, even with maybe that reinforcement from that same podcaster or informational leader, does change really occur? I know myself, I was an avid book reader. I'd go to conferences and conventions. I heard some of the great personal development speakers, purchased a lot of the materials. Their trainings that remained on my shelf a lot of times, but I did read the books. I loved reading books because I'm very much a visual learner, more so than auditory. And so I would get their materials and I'd read it, I'd take notes, but very little in my life changed. Why was that? Again, we can do YouTube. You can go to YouTube and watch videos and gather great information there. Learn how to do things maybe you didn't know. And we've already talked about AI and courses and conferences, but the more information we gain, sometimes the less we change. So even though there's more access to information than any other generation has ever had in history, but what's it doing to us? Is it decreasing our stress? No, I don't think so. It's probably increasing it more than anything. Is it helping leadership? Not necessarily. We still see organizations struggling with employee engagement, so that hasn't been solved. and people still feel stuck, or they might feel like they're not good enough. So that hasn't happened. So maybe more information isn't really the answer. Maybe that more information can sometimes make you feel very overwhelmed. And even, with AI coming into being, have you ever used AI and chatted with AI and you get all this information, more than you can comprehend and retain, and then you can't find it? So all this information isn't necessarily helping us. Yeah, it can help us do things faster. We can learn from others through their books, through their podcasts. But why isn't it changing us? Well, the whole reason is that information isn't transformation. Information's just knowledge. And we have one, having that knowledge is very helpful. But knowing and understanding and doing are quite different. So we have these habits that are stored in our subconscious mind. And those habits are really strong and they're difficult to change. And we've repeated those habits over and over and over again. Now, information and awareness and understanding can certainly help us to figure out, oh, well, this is my problem. This is why I keep doing the same thing, expecting a different result, but getting the same result that I had been. That definition of insanity. Because those habits are strong and we tend to fall back into them. That's why you go to a convention or a seminar and you get all excited because you're going to change. This is the time. Or you decide you're going to go on a diet and you've decided this is the time I'm going to finally release that weight I no longer want. But pretty soon you go right back into those same habits. Because fundamentally, we haven't changed anything. So how do we change a habit? Well, to change the habit, we have to change the thinking that created the habit. And then we have to repeat the new thinking and that new belief until we've formed a new habit and a new set of rules, I guess, that we're operating under. Now, if you're going on a diet, let's say, this is an easy one for most people to understand because we all know, how do you lose weight? Less calories, more exercise. Easy peasy, right? But that doesn't happen because those habits, because those foods that keep saying, oh, I'll just eat this chocolate cake tonight and tomorrow I'll worry about it. And then it becomes another habit. So why does training most often fail in businesses? Well, what do organizations do? They get people training. It might be video training. It might be, online training. It might be live trainers. It might be, whatever. But here's the thing I've noticed. Because I trained in businesses, I know that little's going to change if there's no follow-up. And what most people do is maybe they'll sponsor a workshop at most businesses, or they'll send people to training. They'll send them to another conference to get another certification, perhaps. And none of that's bad. There's nothing wrong with any of that. But they assume that knowledge that they've gained automatically changes behavior. And it doesn't. To change your behavior, you have to change your thinking that underlies that behavior, change your habits to develop new habits. So that's what I do with businesses. And that's what got me so frustrated when I was doing those daily trainings. I knew nothing was going to really change in those lives. I knew I could excite them for a little bit. I could maybe help them understand. But transformation is something that has to be reinforced. So first you have to be aware that there's a problem. And then you have to be able to think deep thoughts, not surface thinking. Sometimes we think everybody thinks, but not really. Not the deep thinking, the reflective thinking. And you know what? We're not really taught to do that. If you think about school, and I can do this because I was an educator too, but you teach information. Again, teaching information. We're filling our heads with knowledge. And in today's world, that knowledge is so easy to get. I think it was Henry Ford that was like, why should I remember this when I can go ask somebody if I have a question? We can, fill our heads with all this knowledge, but it doesn't mean anything's going to change. Think about some of the most educated people. They're not highly successful necessarily just because they're smart or they have a lot of knowledge. It's the action. But we have to think about things. So being aware is huge. That's like the first step, being aware. But then we have to think about it. Think about what it is we're doing that's preventing us from the result that we want. And think deeply on it. And then we have to decide to change what we're doing. Did you hear that? Decide. It starts with a decision. A decision that maybe you're tired of the results that you're getting. And so you want to change. And so you start with that. You develop a new action because, the old action reaction, that's what it takes. And then you start looking at the result that you're getting and decide if that's the result you want or if you want a different result. If that's still not the result you want, you go back. You're aware now. You're reflecting on it. You're making the action changes. And then you just keep repeating that pattern till you get to where you really want to be. And that's how I help people understand the whole transformation process. Transformation is when you develop that awareness and now you understand because you're doing something different. So I want you to write down, let's take out a piece of paper and write down one thing you've learned repeatedly. One thing that maybe you have been taught in training. Maybe one thing that you've learned about life that you were taught. Go back to the dieting. The one thing you may have learned is if I eat less and I exercise more, I'll lose weight. But then think of one thing within that thought that you aren't consistently doing. Because if you're not consistently doing that, you're not going to change your results. So what beliefs, assumptions, or patterns of thinking are keeping the knowledge that you have from becoming the action that you need? That's the knowing doing gap. Maybe you've heard people talk about that. You know what to do. That doesn't mean you're doing it. And this is why businesses will spend enormous amount of money training people, but yet they don't do what they're taught to do. Because knowing and doing are two different things. And until we get that knowledge and the action to work together, our results are going to stay the way they are. And that's what we need to do. We have to develop new habits. There's a great article talking about successful people. And in this article, it's talking about people that are really successful don't like doing the things that people that aren't successful, the ones that are still in that knowing but not doing gap, they don't like doing the things that they need to do in order to be successful, but they want the result. And so they do that. They do the things they don't want to do in order to get the result until they become a habit. And once they become a habit, it's just automatic. And that's when we have really good habits. So sometimes you have to force yourself to do things, to take the actions that you really don't want to do until they become a habit and they become automatic. Think of when you first started driving. I love to use this as an example because I think it's something most people can relate to. But the first time you got in a car, you had to think about everything. Which gear to be in, where the brakes were, where the gas was. Then you had to think about where you were going, how to turn that wheel. Everything was a huge thought process. And now, after years of driving, you hop in a car and sometimes you're maybe driving to work or driving to some place where you go frequently, and you think after you get there, did I get through a red light or was it green? Did I see a school bus? Did I stop for a school bus? Like, you just do things so automatically, you're not even thinking about them. And when you can take that action that you really don't want to do and start doing it until it becomes a habit. Because once it becomes a habit, that's when your thinking has shifted. So you might say the greatest barrier to transformation isn't lack of information. We've covered that. We have plenty of information. It's the thinking, the process, the paradigms or the habits that are controlling us until we take that information and put it into action until it becomes a habit. And that's how you transform your life. It's generally not something impactful that happens. It can be, but usually that's negative. It's just the constant awareness, the making the decision to change, changing the thought process, changing your actions, and repeating those actions until it becomes a habit. So that's going really in depth compared to the article that you may also enjoy. And you'll look at the reflection questions that might help you to apply this today. And if you'd like to continue these conversations, I'd love to have you join the Thinking Shift Weekly, where every Monday I share one new thinking shift that's designed to help you see yourself, your leadership, and your potential differently, because we all have so much more potential than we realize. And often others see our potential before we do, which is a story for another weekly. So if this video encouraged you, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next thinking shift. And until then, keep asking better questions, because one shift in thinking has the power to change everything that follows.